Shadow's second chance, blood-stained teeth gleamed in the dimly lit kennel as the German Shepherd's amber eyes locked onto Mason's with primal intensity. The shelter staff had whispered warnings in hushed tones. "This one's killed before." But what they couldn't see, what only Mason recognized, was that those weren't the eyes of a killer. They were the eyes of a prisoner of war. The massive dog stood motionless in the furthest corner of the concrete enclosure, his muscles coiled tight beneath his dull, patchy coat. Each breath measured and controlled, as if conserving energy for a fight that might come at any moment. When the kennel door creaked open, not a single part of him moved except those haunting eyes, tracking Mason's every motion with the hypervigilance that only comes from surviving the unsurvivable. What bond could possibly form between a broken man and a broken beast? What happened in the days that followed would challenge everything the shelter staff believed about aggressive dogs, and everything Mason believed about healing. Some scars run deeper than skin. Some souls speak without words. And sometimes salvation comes with 4 paws and a damaged heart, bigger than most humans could ever understand. The shadow in Kennel 17. The Desert Hills Animal Shelter smelled like industrial disinfectant trying, and failing, to mask the underlying sense of fear, abandonment, and desperation. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across worn tile floors that had seen thousands of paws come and go, some to freedom, others to their end. Mason Walker's combat boots echoed down the long corridor as he followed the shelter manager past rows of kennels. A chorus of hopeful barks and whines followed his progress, but it was the silence from Kennel 17 that caught his attention. No barking. No barking. No movement. Just watchful stillness. "That one," Mason said, stopping abruptly. Leo, the shelter manager, a heavy-set man with graying temples and permanent worry lines, followed Mason's gaze and immediately shook his head. "No, sir. Not that one." Leo's voice dropped to a near whisper. "That's Shadow, German Shepherd, male, approximately 5 years old. He's not suitable." Mason studied the dog at the back of the kennel. A large shepherd with a thick but uneven coat stood motionless, one ear slightly drooped, amber eyes locked onto Mason's with unsettling focus. "What's his story?" Mason asked, not breaking eye contact with the dog. Leo shifted uncomfortably. "He was brought in after a seizure, animal control case. He's bitten 3 staff members, nearly took a volunteer's arm off, and growls if anyone gets within 5 feet. We've had him for 2 months, and nobody can get near him." Mason nodded slowly. "Why haven't you euthanized him?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. "We keep trying," Leo admitted. "Something about him. I can't explain it. He's not just aggressive. It's like he's waiting for something." Mason moved closer to the bars. The dog remained perfectly still, but a low rumble began in his chest. "I'd like to see him," Mason said quietly. "Sir, I can't let you in there. Sir, I can't let you in there. We have 15 other dogs that would be perfect for—" "I was a Marine 9 handler for 8 years. I've worked with military dogs in active combat zones. I can handle myself." Leo hesitated, his eyes darting from Mason to the dog and back again. "Why him?" Mason's expression softened slightly. "Because nobody else wants him." After several seconds of internal debate, Leo sighed heavily. "Your funeral," he muttered, retrieving a set of keys from his belt. "Stay back when I open it. Let him adjust to your presence." The metal door creaked as it swung open. Mason didn't enter immediately. Instead, he crouched down just outside, keeping his posture low and non-threatening. He didn't speak, didn't extend a hand. The dog's growl deepened, but he didn't lunge. Mason waited. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The growling subsided, but the dog's body remained rigid, his eyes never leaving Mason's face. "Do you know why he's called Shadow?" Leo asked from a safe distance. Mason shook his head slightly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The police report said when they found him, he was standing over the bodies of 2 other dogs. They were dead, but he wouldn't leave them. Just stood there like their shadow covered in blood. They thought he killed them at first. A muscle in Mason's jaw twitched. And did he? Autopsies showed the other dogs died from starvation and untreated wounds. His blood, too, mixed with theirs. He was protecting them, even after they were gone. Mason took one slow step into the kennel. Shadow's ears flattened, but he didn't advance. "I'm not here to hurt you," Mason said in a low, even tone. "I'm just here." 10 minutes passed in complete silence. Finally, Mason backed out of the kennel. "I'll take him," he said without hesitation. Leo stared at him in disbelief. "You haven't even touched him." "I don't need to. Not yet. Not." The silent homecoming, the adoption paperwork came with multiple liability waivers and warnings. Special conditions, experienced handler only, no children in home, secure fencing required, no public dog parks, full responsibility for any incidents. Mason signed them all without comment. When the staff loaded Shadow into the large crate in the back of Mason's truck, the dog didn't resist. He didn't relax either. He simply stared straight ahead, a statue carved from muscle and fur, his breathing so controlled it was barely perceptible. The drive to Mason's home took 40 minutes. He didn't play the radio. Didn't try to talk to the dog. The only sounds were the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional ping of the cooling engine. Mason's home sat on 3 acres of land outside town. A simple 1-story ranch house with a large fenced yard and nothing but hills and sky beyond. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away. Perfect for a man who'd had enough of people. Perfect for a dog who'd had enough of cruelty. When they arrived, Mason didn't immediately open the crate. He let Shadow take in the new scents through the ventilation holes. Let him adjust to the stillness after the movement of the drive. After several minutes, he unlatched the door. Shadow stepped out cautiously, his head low but alert, every muscle ready for fight or flight. Mason stood perfectly still as the dog surveyed his surroundings, nose working overtime, ears swiveling to capture every sound. Without a word, Mason walked to the front door of the house and opened it. No leash, no commands, just an open door and a choice. Shadow hesitated for only a moment before padding silently past Mason into the house. He moved deliberately, scanning each room as if checking for threats, before finally settling in the corner of the living room, where he could see both the front door and the hallway to the rest of the house. His body remained coiled tight, but something had changed. The growling had stopped completely. Mason dropped his keys on the counter and glanced at the dog. "Welcome home," he said softly. It was just the beginning. What Mason would discover about Shadow over the next few days would reveal why this dangerous dog didn't need discipline or training. He needed something far more rare and far more powerful. The language of trust for the first 3 days. Shadow made no sound. No barking, no whining, not even a growl. Just the soft click of his nails on the hardwood floors as he moved from one vigilant post to another. He ate only when Mason wasn't in the room. He drank in quick, nervous gulps, always with one eye on the doorway. Mason gave him space. He left the back door open during daylight hours, so Shadow could access the fenced yard freely. He kept food and water available at all times. He didn't try to pet him, didn't call his name, didn't force interactions. He simply existed in the same space. Quiet, unthreatening, present. At night, Shadow didn't sleep. Mason could hear him pacing through the darkness, the rhythm of his movement, like a sentry on patrol. 3 circuits around the living room. Pause at the front door. Check the windows. Move to the hallway. Stop outside Mason's bedroom door. Listen, then repeat. The pattern never varied, and it never stopped. Dawn would find the dog still on guard, amber eyes bloodshot but alert. The behavior stirred something in Mason's memory. Something from his deployments. The hypervigilance, the inability to rest, the constant checking of exits and entry points. Shadow wasn't just afraid. He was on duty. On the 4th morning, Mason sat on the back porch with a cup of black coffee. The sun had just begun to paint the hills gold, and the air still held the cool crispness of night. He heard the soft click of claws on wood and didn't turn around. Shadow appeared beside him, maintaining a careful distance, but closer than he'd ever voluntarily come before. He sat, not relaxed, not touching, but near enough that Mason could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Mason didn't look directly at him, didn't speak, didn't reach out. He simply nodded slightly, acknowledging the choice Shadow had made. The dog showed up again the next morning, and the one after that. Always at the same time, always maintaining the exact same distance, always in silence. By the end of the first week, subtle changes had begun to appear. Shadow no longer flinched when Mason moved around the kitchen. His pacing at night had decreased, limited now to only 2 checks before settling near the front door. When the mail carrier approached, he didn't bark. He simply stood at attention, watching until the threat passed. What struck Mason most happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky had darkened suddenly, pregnant with imminent rain. When the first crash of thunder shook the windows, Shadow disappeared. Curious, Mason followed the sound of light scratching to find the shepherd wedged between the washing machine and the wall in the laundry room. His massive body was trembling, eyes wide, breath coming in short, shallow pants. Mason didn't approach. He simply sat down on the floor across the room and waited. "I get it," he said quietly. Thunder cracked again, and Shadow's eyes flicked toward him. That's when Mason noticed the scar, a long, jagged line running along the dog's left flank, mostly hidden by fur. It wasn't a surgical scar. It was the kind that comes from a blade or broken glass, healed without stitches or care. "Someone did a number on you, didn't they?" Mason's voice was gentle, with no pity, just recognition. The next day, Mason contacted Leo for Shadow's full intake records. What he received made his stomach turn. Shadow hadn't come from a standard surrender. He'd been seized during a police raid on a property where dogfighting was suspected. 3 other dogs had been found with him, 2 already dead, 1 barely alive. The report stated that Shadow was discovered chained to a post, severely undernourished, covered in both fresh and healed wounds. The aggressive label hadn't come from his behavior at the shelter. It had come from how he looked when they found him, muzzle covered in blood, teeth bared, standing over the bodies of his fallen companions. That night, Mason sat on the porch again. Shadow lay beside him, not touching but closer than before. His breathing slow and measured. "You weren't protecting yourself, were you?" Mason said softly. "You were protecting them?" Shadow turned his head slightly, and for the first time, he held Mason's gaze without tension or fear. Something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. This wasn't a dangerous dog. This was a guardian who had failed his charge and lived with the consequences. Mason recognized that burden all too well. But the true test of trust was coming, because the very next day, Shadow would do something that would change both their lives forever. The visitor the morning began like any other. Mason filled Shadow's bowl, opened the back door, and sat at the small table by the window with his coffee. Shadow had established a quiet routine, eating slowly, making a thorough patrol of the yard's perimeter. then settling on the porch like a sentry. But that day, something was different. Mason noticed it immediately. Shadow didn't touch his food. He didn't move toward the open door. Instead, he stood rigidly in the center of the kitchen, head low, eyes fixed on something beyond the window. Mason followed his gaze. There, parked just off the dirt road that led to his property, was an old blue pickup truck. The engine was off, no movement visible inside, just sitting there like a predator waiting to strike. Mason stepped outside. Shadow didn't follow, but his body language shifted, shoulders squared, tail stiff, ears pinned back. His entire frame vibrated with tension. After a minute, the truck slowly rolled forward and disappeared down the road. Mason memorized what he could see of the license plate. Just a partial, the rest obscured by mud or deliberately covered. Later that afternoon, Mason called Leo. "Do you have any record of who owned Shadow before he was seized?" he asked. Leo hesitated on the other end. "It's sealed. Court case involving animal cruelty and organized fighting." "Why?" "Someone was watching my property this morning." Shadow reacted. Strongly. Leo's voice lowered. "It might be nothing, but I wouldn't take chances. The guy they took Shadow from, Victor Mercer, he didn't do time. Lack of evidence. Just lost the dogs and paid a fine." Mason thanked him and hung up, a cold weight settling in his stomach. That night, he moved Shadow's bed to the foot of his own. He checked the locks twice, loaded the hunting rifle he kept secured in his closet. Shadow didn't pace that night. He lay at the bedroom doorway, alert but calm, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. The next day brought the confrontation that would change everything. Mason was in the garage repairing a section of fence panel when he heard it, a sound that stopped his heart. Shadow was barking, not just barking. The sound was explosive, thunderous, a declaration of war. In the 8 days since bringing Shadow home, Mason had never heard him make a single sound. He dropped his tools and ran through the back door, across the kitchen, and into the yard. What he saw made his blood run cold. The same blue truck was parked in front of his gate. A man stood at the fence, medium height, weathered face, wearing a stained canvas jacket. He was shouting toward the house. "I know that dog's in there! That's my damn dog!" Shadow stood between the man and the house, teeth bared, shoulders rigid. His bark was non-stop, but he wasn't charging or trying to get through the fence. He was holding his position, creating a barrier between the threat and his home. Mason stepped up beside him. "You need to leave," he said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. The man didn't budge. "That dog's mine. You think the shelter told you everything? That dog's trained. I raised him." Mason's jaw tightened. "You raised him to survive. I know exactly what you did to him." The man, Victor, Mason presumed, stared at Shadow, who had not moved an inch, then back at Mason. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. "You better watch your back," he muttered, then turned, climbed into his truck, and peeled away in a cloud of dust. After the truck was gone, Shadow turned his head slowly to look at Mason. The barking stopped, the tension drained from his powerful frame, and he walked over to press his body gently against Mason's leg. It wasn't fear. It wasn't fear. It was a question. "Are we safe now?" Mason knelt down and, for the first time, wrapped an arm around the dog's broad shoulders. "You're never going back," he whispered. "You're home." That was the moment everything changed. Shadow didn't just protect Mason's property. He had claimed it as his own territory worth defending. But Mason knew the fight wasn't over, because Victor Mercer wasn't finished yet. The warning 4 days passed without incident. Mason had filed a police report, but there wasn't much they could do. No full license plate, no direct threats, No trespassing since Victor had remained outside the fence. They logged the complaint, advised Mason to stay vigilant, and promised to increase patrols in the area. Mason was already taking precautions. He changed Shadow's outdoor schedule, installed motion-activated security lights, and mounted trail cameras near the road. But what changed most was Shadow himself. Since the confrontation, something in the dog had shifted. He no longer skirted the walls when moving through the house. He followed Mason from room to room with confident strides. He slept deeply at night, though always positioned between Mason's bed and the door. He still watched the property with vigilant eyes, but the desperate tension had been replaced by calm purpose. Mason could feel it. Shadow no longer saw himself as a rescued animal. He saw himself as a protector with a job to do. Late Thursday night the knock came. Not loud, just slow, deliberate, calculated. Mason froze, mid-step in the hallway, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. Shadow was already at the front door, body rigid but controlled. Mason peered through the peephole. No one was visible. He hesitated, then opened the door just enough to scan the porch. There, propped against the railing, sat a plain white envelope with his name scrawled across the front in uneven handwriting. He picked it up and closed the door quickly, sliding the deadbolt into place. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with 5 words. "He's my dog. I'm coming." No signature. No explicit threat. Just a promise. Shadow didn't leave the front of the house all night. He lay with his muzzle on his paws, eyes fixed on the door, ears shifting at every sound from outside. The next morning, Mason drove into town with a purpose. Not to run errands, but to speak with someone who might help him end this once and for all. At the county records office, after producing his ID and explaining his situation, he was given access to the public records of the case that had brought Shadow into his life. The details were worse than he'd imagined. Victor Mercer had a history. 2 prior arrests for animal cruelty, 1 dismissed charge of organized animal fighting, a restraining order from an ex-girlfriend who claimed he'd threatened her pets. No convictions, but a pattern clear as day to anyone who cared to look. Mason sat in his truck, staring at the documents, then looked at Shadow, who sat calmly in the passenger seat, his amber eyes watchful, but no longer haunted. "You were never safe with him," Mason said quietly. Shadow blinked slowly, as if in agreement. It was time to stop reacting. Mason made his preparations. He reinforced the back gate, programmed the local police number on speed dial, and slept fully clothed with his boots beside the bed. He wasn't waiting for the next move. He was ready for it. At 2:38 a.m., Shadow growled, a sound so low and deep it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Mason was instantly awake, pulling on his boots and grabbing the flashlight from his nightstand. Shadow stood by the back window, nose pressed to the glass, every muscle tense with alert focus. Mason looked out and saw it, a shadow moving along the edge of the property, keeping to the trees, approaching the back fence. He moved silently through the house, Shadow at his heel. At the back door, he paused, laid a hand on Shadow's head, and whispered, "Stay close." Together, they slipped into the darkness. Mason moved with the careful precision of his military training, using the shadows for cover, making his way toward the back fence where he'd seen the movement. At first, he saw nothing. Then, just beyond the tree line, a figure stepped into a patch of moonlight. Victor Mercer stood there, staring toward the house, something clutched in his right hand that Mason couldn't identify. "That's far enough," Mason called out, his voice steady and carrying. Victor startled, then squinted into the darkness. "Where's my dog?" "He's not your dog anymore," Mason replied. "The adoption is legal." "You'll need to leave." Victor took a step forward. "That dog is trained for a purpose. He's worth money to me." Shadow stood beside Mason, unnaturally still. He wasn't barking, wasn't growling, just standing his ground, eyes locked on Victor. "He's chosen his purpose," Mason said simply. "And it's not with you." Victor's hand tightened around the object he was holding. Mason could now see it was some kind of metal chain or collar. "He remembers me. He knows what happens when he doesn't obey." "He remembers," Mason agreed, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "That's why he'll never go near you again." As if to punctuate the point, Shadow took one deliberate step forward. He didn't bare his teeth or growl. He simply stood tall, head high, ears forward. The posture wasn't aggressive. It was definitive. Victor stared at the dog for a long moment, waiting for something. Maybe fear, maybe submission. But Shadow didn't cower. He didn't flinch. He simply held his ground. Something in Victor's face changed. For just a moment, uncertainty replaced arrogance. He took one step back, then another, before disappearing into the darkness beyond the property line. That night, for the first time since arriving at Mason's home, Shadow slept on his side, belly exposed, completely vulnerable. Mason knew exactly what that meant in dog language: absolute trust. The battle wasn't over, but a major victory had been won. What neither of them knew yet was that Victor had one more move to make. A legal claim that would force them to fight for Shadow's future in a very different arena. The claim 3 days later, Mason stood in his kitchen staring at a certified letter like it might explode in his hands. Pet ownership dispute hearing 72 hours. Attendance mandatory. Bring all relevant documentation regarding animal ID #77235. German Shepherd, male. It was signed by the county clerk and accompanied by a copy of a handwritten claim filed by Victor Mercer, alleging unlawful seizure and improper adoption of his personal property. One German Shepherd dog, approximately 5 years old, with identifying markings matching Shadow's description. As evidence, Victor had submitted an old veterinary receipt from 3 years prior and a grainy photograph of a younger Shadow chained in a dirt yard. Shadow lay nearby, head resting calmly on his front paws, eyes tracking Mason's every move. He had no idea what was at stake, but Mason did. The claim wasn't based on current ownership. It was based on prior possession. Even with Shadow's troubled history, the court couldn't simply ignore it. Mason had 72 hours to prove that Shadow didn't belong with the man who used to own him. His first call was to Leo at the shelter. "They're actually allowing this to proceed?" "They're actually allowing this to proceed?" Leo asked, clearly shocked. "They're required to," Mason explained. "There's documentation, not much, but enough to open a hearing." "You need evidence," Leo said firmly. "Behavioral reports, veterinary statements, photographic documentation on how he's recovered under your care." "I have most of that from the records office, but it won't be enough without expert testimony." Leo paused. "I might know someone who can help." The next morning, Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived at Mason's home. She was in her early 40s with calm, observant eyes and a quiet confidence that reminded Mason of the best officers he'd served under. As a certified animal behaviorist who specialized in trauma cases, she had testified in dozens of abuse cases. "I'll need to observe him in his natural environment," she explained. "No commands, no structured interactions. Just you and him, living normally." Mason nodded and led her inside. Shadow was lying on the living room rug. When he saw the stranger, he rose smoothly to his feet, alert but not alarmed. Dr. Mitchell didn't approach him. Instead, she sat on the floor a respectful distance away. "Does he allow touch?" she asked quietly. Mason knelt beside Shadow and ran a hand slowly along his back. The dog leaned into the contact, his eyes half closing in contentment. Dr. Mitchell made notes, then watched as Mason and Shadow moved through their morning routine. Breakfast, a walk around the property, a brief training session where Shadow demonstrated his perfect recall, and finally, a game with his favorite rope toy. He shows no signs of aggression, she said after 2 hours of observation. But more importantly, he shows restraint, stability, and secure attachment. The progress he's made is remarkable. She lowered her voice. That doesn't come from training. That comes from healing. That evening, Mason prepared his evidence. He printed photos documenting Shadow's transformation. From the terrified, reactive dog who had cowered in the shelter kennel to the confident, balanced animal who now slept peacefully at his feet. He organized veterinary records showing improved weight, coat condition, and overall health. He wrote a detailed account of Shadow's behavioral changes, citing specific examples of newfound trust and stability. The next morning, Dr. Mitchell sent her official assessment. The animal identified as Shadow exhibits clear trauma recovery under current care. His behavior reflects secure attachment, emotional regulation, and a consistent, supportive environment. In my professional opinion, relocation to a previous environment associated with documented abuse would result in severe regression and significant psychological harm. Mason folded the report and placed it in a folder with the rest of his evidence. Time was running out. That night, he and Shadow sat on the porch as the sun disappeared behind the hills. Mason looked down at his companion, seeing not the broken animal from the shelter, but the loyal guardian who had found his purpose. "You ready for tomorrow?" he asked softly. Shadow lifted his head, then gently rested it on Mason's knee. Mason smiled faintly. "I didn't rescue you, did I? You rescued me. The one man wanted to reclaim a possession. The other was fighting to protect his family. What happened inside that hearing room would determine Shadow's fate forever." The county courthouse was unusually quiet that morning. The ownership dispute hearing was closed to the public. Just a clerk, a judge, 2 attorneys, and the men who both claimed the same dog. Victor Mercer sat stiffly in a worn suit jacket, his restless fingers drumming against his knee. His attorney, a local general practice lawyer, leafed through a slim folder with visible disinterest. Across the aisle, Mason sat calmly, a thick portfolio of documentation on the table before him. Dr. Sarah Mitchell sat beside him, reviewing her notes one final time, and lying quietly at Mason's feet, as if this were just another morning at home, was Shadow. He wore no muzzle, no restrictive harness, just a simple blue collar with his name engraved on a silver tag. He rested with his head on Mason's boot, eyes half closed but alert to every movement in the room. Judge Eleanor Harmon, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency, entered and called the hearing to order. Victor's attorney spoke first, his tone bored and mechanical. "My client, Mr. Mercer, was the lawful owner of this animal for approximately 3 years, as evidenced by these veterinary records. The dog went missing from his property and was later improperly seized by animal control. Before Mr. Mercer could file the appropriate paperwork, the animal was adopted out without his knowledge or consent." He paused, then added with rehearsed indignation, "Mr. Mercer simply wants his property returned." Judge Harmon looked unimpressed. "Mr. Mercer, how long was this animal missing before you attempted to reclaim him?" Victor cleared his throat nervously. I didn't know where he'd gone. Thought maybe someone stole him. Didn't have time to file anything. And how did you locate him?" Victor hesitated. "Someone told me they'd seen a dog like mine out near the old military housing. I tracked him down." The judge made a note, then turned to Mason. "Mr. Walker, you adopted this animal legally through Desert Hills Animal Shelter, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." Mason's voice was steady and clear. "I have the complete adoption records here, signed by Shelter Director Leo Reyes and approved by County Animal Services." He handed forward the first set of documents. The judge reviewed them briefly, then nodded. "And you were made aware of the animal's history at the time of adoption?" "I was informed he had behavioral issues, yes. After adoption, I requested and received his full case file, including the details of his seizure from Mr. Mercer's property." Mason opened the folder and placed the first photograph before the judge. Shadow in the shelter kennel, emaciated and distant. "This is how he looked when I first met him," Mason said quietly. He slid forward another photo, Shadow sleeping peacefully near Mason's bed. "This is him, 3 weeks later." He continued, laying down the timeline in images. Shadow relaxing in the sun, playing with a rope toy, leaning into Mason's touch, each one showing a visible transformation. Finally, he handed over Dr. Mitchell's report. "Dr. Mitchell is a certified animal behaviorist. Her evaluation confirms Shadow has recovered from significant trauma under my care. Returning him to his former environment would cause irreversible regression." The judge reviewed the documents in silence. Finally, Dr. Mitchell spoke. "Your Honor, this is not simply a matter of ownership. It's a matter of welfare. This dog was not just lost. He was found chained, malnourished, and psychologically damaged. The evidence of prior mistreatment is overwhelming." Victor's attorney rose quickly. "Objection! That's speculative." Judge Harmon waved him down. "It's professional testimony, and I'll allow it." She studied Victor intently. "Mr. Mercer, I have a question. Do you want this dog back because you care for him, or because you believe he still serves your purposes?" Victor didn't answer immediately, his eyes darting to Shadow and back. The judge then looked at Shadow, who remained calm at Mason's feet. "Mr. Walker, can you and the animal approach?" Mason stood and Shadow rose with him. Together they walked slowly to the center of the room. Shadow stayed perfectly at Mason's side, his movements fluid and confident. "Stay," Mason whispered. Shadow sat and remained still. Judge Harmon leaned forward. "What happens if Mr. Mercer approaches him now?" Mason looked at Shadow. "You can try," he said quietly. Victor stood and took one step forward. Shadow didn't bark or growl, but his entire body tensed instantly. He didn't cower or show fear. Instead, he straightened his spine, raised his head, and locked eyes with Victor. The message was unmistakable. "I see you, and I am not afraid anymore." Victor stopped mid-step and slowly sat back down. Judge Harmon's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I've seen it off." 20 minutes later, she delivered her ruling. "This court recognizes that the animal known as Shadow is best served remaining in the care of Mr. Mason Walker. The motion to reclaim ownership is denied. The adoption is confirmed as legal and permanent." Victor stormed out without a word, his attorney trailing behind. Outside the courthouse, Mason knelt beside Shadow in the warm sunlight. "We did it," he whispered, pressing his forehead gently against the dog's. Shadow leaned in, his entire body relaxing as if a great weight had finally been lifted. Mason didn't know yet that Shadow had one last surprise in store, a secret that would complete the circle of their journey in a way neither of them could have imagined. The true name. A week had passed since the court ruling. The quiet around Mason's home had never felt more peaceful. The legal threat was gone, the fear was gone, and Shadow had blossomed in the security of knowing he was truly home. He no longer startled at sudden movements. He slept deeply through the night, sometimes twitching and woofing softly as he chased dream rabbits. He greeted Mason each morning by pressing his head against Mason's hand, a gesture of connection rather than neediness. Yet something still lingered in Shadow's eyes, not fear, not uncertainty, but a question that hadn't yet been answered. It happened on a sunny Tuesday morning. Mason had taken Shadow to the lakeside park at the edge of town. It was their first real public outing, and Shadow had handled it beautifully. Calm on his leash, politely disinterested in other dogs, watchful but not reactive. They were walking along the shore, Shadow's paws leaving perfect prints in the damp sand, when the dog suddenly stopped. His body went still, not in fear but in alert recognition, his eyes fixed on something across the parking lot. Mason followed his gaze to see a woman in her 30s standing beside a small SUV. She was staring at Shadow, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Cautiously, Mason approached her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's just, I never thought I'd see him again." The woman's name was Olivia Bennett. 2 years ago, she had been part of a rescue organization that assisted with emergency animal seizures. She and her team had helped pull 3 severely abused dogs from a property under court order, but one had disappeared during transport. A large male German Shepherd. He bolted when the transport van door was opened. She explained, showing Mason a photo on her phone of a younger, thinner Shadow. "We searched for weeks, filed reports everywhere. I thought maybe he'd been hit by a car, or worse." Mason's throat tightened as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Olivia knelt down slowly, keeping a respectful distance. "We called him Valor," she said softly. "That's the name we gave him when we rescued him." "That's the name we gave him when we rescued him." Because even hurt and terrified, he stood between us and the other dogs, trying to protect them. Shadow, Valor, didn't flinch. He looked at her for a long moment, then stepped forward and gently licked her hand, a gesture of recognition, of forgiveness. But then he turned back to Mason and sat beside him, his decision clear. Olivia smiled through her tears. "He's telling you that you're his human now." That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mason sat on the porch steps, the dog beside him, both of them watching the light fade behind the distant hills. "I don't care what name you had before," Mason said quietly. "You'll always be Shadow to me. But now I understand why you were standing over those other dogs, why you never left them, even when you could have escaped." The dog sighed contentedly and rested his head on Mason's lap. Valor, Shadow, the names were different, but the soul was the same. A guardian by nature, a protector by choice. Some dogs aren't born aggressive. They're made frightened, and with patience, respect, and love, they don't just heal. They transform the lives of those lucky enough to earn their trust. Beyond the Shadow, the transformation in Shadow wasn't just physical. While his coat now gleamed with health, and his once thin frame had filled out with proper nutrition and exercise, the more profound changes were in his spirit. The dog who once paced ceaselessly now slept deeply, secure in the knowledge that vigilance was no longer his burden alone. The animal who had flinched at every sudden movement now played with abandon, his joyful bounds across the yard a testament to inner freedom. The guardian who once stood rigid at the door now greeted visitors with cautious curiosity rather than suspicion. For Mason, the changes had been equally profound. The silence that had once felt suffocating now felt comfortable. The isolation that had been his refuge became a choice rather than a necessity. The nightmares that had plagued him since leaving the service came less frequently, and when they did, a warm body would press against him in the darkness, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. They had healed each other, this man and this dog, teaching each other to trust again. As summer turned to fall, Mason made a decision. He contacted Dr. Mitchell and asked a question that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Could Shadow be trained as a therapy dog? Her answer surprised him. He already is one for you. The real question is whether he's ready to help others. The training was extensive. Shadow needed to learn to remain calm in chaotic environments, to accept handling from strangers, to ignore distractions. But beneath the specific commands and controlled exposures, the true lesson was simple. The world could be safe again. 6 months later, Mason pulled his truck into the parking lot of the Veterans Rehabilitation Center, where he'd once been a patient himself. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, wearing a blue therapy dog vest that matched his collar. "Ready?" Mason asked. Shadow's tail thumped against the seat. Once, twice, 3 times. Ready. Inside, they worked with soldiers adjusting to civilian life. Young men and women struggling with the same hypervigilance, insomnia, and isolation that had once defined both Mason and Shadow. Some were missing limbs. Others were physically whole but carried invisible wounds just as deep. While Mason talked with them about his own journey, Shadow moved among them with gentle confidence, leaning against a knee here, resting his head on a hand there, his presence offering comfort without demands. After their 3rd visit, the center's director pulled Mason aside. "I've never seen Parker smile," she said, nodding toward a young Marine in a wheelchair. "Not once in the 6 months he's been here." Today he smiled when your dog put his head on his lap. Mason watched as Parker tentatively stroked Shadow's ear. "That's how it starts," he said quietly. "One moment of connection. One moment when the walls come down." The work wasn't always easy. There were days when Shadow became overwhelmed, seeking the quiet corner of Mason's truck to decompress. There were patients who weren't ready to reach out, even to a dog. But each small victory, a moment of laughter, a moment of peace, a moment of connection, made the effort worthwhile. What made Shadow so effective wasn't specialized training or extraordinary intelligence. It was simpler than that. He had walked through darkness and emerged into light. He knew the path because he had traveled it himself. The lessons of Shadow, the story of Shadow and Mason, reminds us of truths that extend far beyond the relationship between one man and one dog. It speaks to the very essence of healing, trust, and the remarkable capacity for transformation that exists in all living beings. First, there is the lesson of judgment. When Shadow stood in that shelter kennel, the label aggressive defined him in the eyes of nearly everyone who saw him. But aggression is rarely a character trait. It's almost always a response to fear, pain, or the desperate need to protect. How often do we apply simplistic labels to complex beings, human or animal, based on behaviors we see without understanding their root causes? Then, there is the profound message about patience. Mason didn't demand trust from Shadow. He created the conditions where trust could grow naturally. He understood that healing follows its own timeline, that progress isn't linear, and that setbacks aren't failures. In our fast-paced world obsessed with immediate results, we would do well to remember that the most meaningful transformations often happen slowly, invisibly, in the quiet moments between dramatic changes. Shadow's story also teaches us about resilience, not as an innate trait, but as a capacity that can be nurtured. Despite everything he endured, Shadow retained his essential nature as a protector. The cruelty he experienced damaged, but didn't destroy his ability to form connections. This reminds us that trauma, while profound in its impact, doesn't have to be the end of the story. With the right support, even the deepest wounds can heal. Perhaps most powerfully, this journey illuminates the reciprocal nature of healing. Mason thought he was rescuing Shadow, but in many ways, Shadow was rescuing him. By giving Mason someone to care for, a reason to establish routines, and living proof that recovery was possible, Shadow provided exactly what Mason needed to address his own invisible wounds. This beautiful symmetry appears often in relationships between humans and animals. The givers become receivers. The healers are healed. There's a saying that rescued dogs love differently, with a gratitude and devotion that seems to transcend ordinary attachment. But perhaps what we're seeing isn't just gratitude. Perhaps it's recognition. One survivor acknowledging another. One healing heart resonating with another. The next time you pass a shelter and see a dog labeled difficult or special needs, remember Shadow. Remember that behind those anxious eyes or defensive growls might be a soul of extraordinary courage and loyalty, waiting for someone who sees beyond the surface. And the next time you encounter a person struggling with their own invisible battles, whether addiction, trauma, mental illness, or loss, remember Mason. Remember that healing often begins not with grand interventions, but with simple presence. With the courage to sit beside someone in their darkness without trying to force them into the light. This is the deeper truth at the heart of Shadow's story. Sometimes the souls that have been most deeply wounded have the most to give. And sometimes the path to healing lies not in escaping our shadows, but in embracing them, in recognizing that the darkest parts of our journey have shaped us in ways that allow us to connect with and help others. A final thought: as the sun sets on our story, Shadow and Mason continue their work. At the Veterans Center, at local schools where children learn about compassion for animals, and in their quiet moments at home, where each day brings new discoveries about trust, joy, and connection. Their journey reminds us that labels like aggressive or damaged or hopeless are too small to contain the potential within any living being. It reminds us that second chances are not just acts of kindness, but opportunities for transformation that ripple outward, touching countless other lives. If this story moved you, perhaps you might consider giving a second chance to a shelter animal in your own community. Perhaps you might look with new eyes at the difficult ones, the ones who have been waiting the longest, the ones whose potential is hidden beneath layers of fear or mistrust. Or perhaps you might extend that same compassion to the humans in your life, recognizing that behaviors that challenge or frustrate you often have deeper roots in experiences you may never fully understand. We'd love to hear your stories about the special animals who have changed your lives. Have you ever adopted a pet who others overlooked? Have you witnessed a remarkable transformation in an animal who was given a second chance? Thank you for joining us on Shadow's journey from darkness into light. If his story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. And remember, sometimes the most beautiful stories begin in the shadows. What animal has changed your life? Share your story in the comments below.